I want to start by saying that it's a kind of contemporary attitude, I would say, to be somewhat preoccupied with the self. I think people say it in lots of ways, don't they? They say it's a selfish age. That's quite common. There's a kind of bad social science word for it, isn't it? It's neoliberal, they say. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I think it's common to say that it's kind of a narcissistic time, that the culture that we're bringing our children up in is unduly interested in the selfie. There was a good paper the other day talking about mental health and the selfie, taking a picture of yourself and what that means, which apparently is really bad, which is a bit of a nuisance, I think, for my daughter, who's obviously round the twist, judging by the number of selfies she takes. The self-interest would sometimes used to characterize the times. I think there is a point to that, and you can see a number of features, I suppose. One would be, the obvious one would be, it's a celebrity culture. We're very interested in the idea of celebrity, and we have some quite extraordinary characters we call celebrities that we put in front of ourselves and gawp and goggle at their weird behaviour and outlandish personalities. We're thrilled at just how strange they are, and we kind of half feel ourselves reflected in them. But then the moment that we talk them up, usually we tear them down just as aggressively, seemingly for the fun of it. That would be celebrity culture. And what people usually say, when it's, I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. Where are the celebrities? Is this, where it's always a C-list celebrity. The idea of celebrity, I should say, is not novel. They used the word. I was amazed to see that, when they were talking about the explorer Stanley, in a letter, somebody says, well, you have to get used to being a celebrity now. So it's not entirely invented. But I do think there's something about our modern time being celebrity-focused. I think another sense in which the self is a subject and a topic is, you would say, an explosion of therapy, of people working on the self. I mean, obviously it starts before Freud in lots of ways, and it's a component perhaps of the confessional and various religious motifs, but it's a 20th century phenomenon, I think, really, therapy. But more than that, what was really a kind of very precise constituency of people roughly in Vienna and New York who were interested in therapy. We've seen something of an explosion of therapy, and the government's concerned with mental health, and they want to, they're under a certain amount of pressure to make available cognitive behavioural therapies, one of the many therapies on offer. It's not analysis, but it's a therapy. And I have no axe to grind or expertise on that, just to notice, I think, that whereas maybe in another time you'd been embarrassed to talk quite so much about yourself, I think nowadays it's a legitimate, talking point. Oh, I feel so bad. I'm a particular fan of Rachel Cusk's novels, which are always so angry and thrilling. And I'm thrilled to see that the new one is all about people talking about themselves to her, which she records in the thing. And I think it's a modern disease. People are very keen to talk about themselves, as I do from time to time, slip into. So I want to say, more than therapy, it's like a therapeutic idiom, and you'll see it. It's quite extraordinary in the human resources department just how quickly people kind of talk about your impending unemployment as what can we do to help you through this trial? Not here's your cards, or better still, here's a payment. How can we talk you through? Are you talking to people? Or as somebody said at a nursery where I was taking my daughter a while back, she said, what is your support group like? She said, picking me up on something, and I said angrily, I haven't got a support group. I've never heard, meaning what a ridiculous piece of sociological jargon. And I could see a tick in the box. He's got no support group, problem individual, because I didn't know the language. Anyway, but so it was intriguing kind of, it's a therapeutic mode of understanding how people situate themselves. I think there are good reasons for that. It's measurable too. There's a thing they call the European Values Survey. There's now a World Values Survey. And they call the report, which is based on polling all across different European countries. It's all systematized now over some years. It happens in the US too. And every year they publish the report, and it's always got some title along the lines of greater individuation. They're interested in the idea of individuation, and they talk about how people's lives are oriented more towards their inner lives and success, and less towards associations and membership of organizations. And there are many different kinds of measures of this. For example, there's exponential, a slow rise in the number of people living alone. If you look at family size as a simple measure, you say, how do people live? And the answer is they, over a century, they live in averagely smaller units over time, and the numbers of them who live as single individuals increases. And I think that's kind of measurable sign, if you like, of a more individuated society. So all measurable kind of aspects of the ways we might say this is a more individualistic culture. However, having said all that, I want to I'm really, as it were, arguing with that broad brush. We are more selfish now, we're more individualistic, we're more greedy, small-minded, selfish, atomistic, because I think there's a misunderstanding in the middle of it all, and it's a natural misunderstanding that you can make, because as you're kind of sat, as I would be on the train, as it was just a moment ago, and everybody's nattering around me and I'm trying to read and I'm thinking, oh, they're so selfish, I say selfishly, and you can be very conscious of other people. I think it's quite easy to feel a bit sensitive about what other people are doing, talking. Maybe they're talking about you, that would be even worse. Maybe they wouldn't be, that would be even worse still. And a strong sense that other people are selfish. And we often, how selfish of you to butt into the queue that you didn't notice, how selfish of you to do this, that, and we're compelled by a strong, we see people with their mobile phones walking down the road. You're so selfish. Why don't you look where you're going? And I think it's a strong motif that I want to kind of unpick in a way or argue with, which is, I don't think this is a very selfish age. I don't think this isn't, even though I can understand why we would say it's very individualistic, I don't see it as an era of strong individuals. I don't see it as a robust era of robust individuals. And I'm trying to slightly shift the ground to talk not so much about the individual, but what I'd like to call, we've called in the title of the thing, agency, or subjectivity. And the idea of agency or subjectivity is somewhat different. It's not precise, it's not entirely commensurate with the idea of individual. But a concept of, which I think is very familiar. I'm not introducing anything new here. It's a kind of basic structure, I would like to say, of modern contemporary society that it assumes we're agents, or you might say authors, or subjects, or masters of our own destiny, in the sense that you cannot relate to other human beings if they don't accept responsibility for what they do and have interests. It's not possible, really. I mean, I'm saying it's not possible. People lived in tribal societies who had quite different self-conceptions, or, in other kinds of worlds. But in a modern world, all our relationships, one to another, rest on this fact that we assume that the other person is a person like us, that the other person is a person with goals, who's naturally have their own ambitions, want to achieve them, and will compromise with you because of that. And that's the condition, really, that any of us ever manage to get on, if you can't do that, if you meet, I mean, we do occasionally, I think they're called psychotics, but I'm not an expert, people that simply can't keep a promise or tell the truth. You've met those people from time to time, and they're not people it's very useful to know, are they? Or they do tend to let you down. People that tell you lies about what they're doing or where they are or who they're seeing or, what you're going to do together, you'll learn over time not to have too much to do with those because, you just can't. You can't go through your life talking to people who will not behave as responsible agents of their own destiny and will not accept the promises that they enter into. And they're gladly, compelling that it is the case, but they're very few and far between. Most of us, most of the time, are really good at that. When you see people coming through the ticket barriers or paying for the drinks or doing all of those things, most of them really, really well behaved. And driving. Think about driving a car. I suppose most of you might have licenses. All of us put our heads in a vice, don't we? And we assume that all these other people with a ton of metal are not going to crash into you because we're in a contract, a social contract, maybe a mutually destruction kind of contract. But whatever the motivation, I feel that I know that most people are going to be pretty civil on the road. And it's surprising. People often say how bad other drivers are, but I'm always amazed how good they are. That they don't crash into you or steal your parking space unless they happen to be in a really bad mood, but mostly they're very, very well behaved. And that's because we assume reasonably that other people are responsible for themselves. They're agents, that they create their own life history and they do it through a series of compromises. And we know that they're like that because that's what we're like. That's the only way we know. Everything else is kind of deductive reasoning, but it's from reflecting upon yourself that you think you know what other people are like. Philosophers often make the point, well, you don't know that they're not all robots who've been put there. Maybe philosophers need to get out more, but philosophers are lunatics. So it's a problem. It's called the problem of other minds. Can we know there are other minds? But we know there are other minds because we've got minds and we expect other people to be like us. So that assumption of agency and subjectivity, of responsibility, of that other people are people with interests, not that they've got the same interests as you, because that would be disappointing, wouldn't it? Have you ever seen the film Being John Malkovich, where everybody turns into John Malkovich at one point, and there's a whole rest. You've probably never seen now, but why I'm talking about this. But if you have, it's a nightmare scenario where everybody is the same and they all speak the same at the same time, like North Korea, I suppose. But I've never been there, so I don't want to say to that. But if other people weren't individuals, it would be scary. Now, having said all that, I think this is a very robust structure and it's compellingly important and useful. But I want to say that as things stand, it's very, very easily problematized. I think the idea of responsibility and agency right now are a bit wobbly. They are a bit questionable. I think a lot of people, for understandable reasons and or strange reasons, are a bit nervous or not really believing or not trusting or not happy with the individualism which seems to be at the core of our social interaction. And I think if you look at a number of kind of contemporary controversies, you can see that they all turn on this question of the agent, of the agent as a realistic social structure. So my examples would be, so if you take the example, this is a recent one, you might have read about this, that the Exhibit B is an art show. It's on at the Barbican, it was at the Edinburgh, and it features black people in chains looking at the audience. They're live participants. They've talked to Bill Brett, the guy that brought it together, and the idea is it's recreating a human zoo, many people are provoked by it. It is a provocative work, there's no doubt about it. It's very emotional, and it's open to the objection, which was raised by a number of people who protested outside the Barbican, effectively prevented it from opening or persuaded the Barbican it was too dangerous to open, that it was an offence, that the thing was that the whole exhibit was not a critique of racial oppression, but an act of racial oppression. And I don't want to, kind of get into, who's right or who's wrong and all that, but just to reflect for a moment that everybody in the whole debate are really talking about the same thing, about their insecurity, about to be a free person. The work is interested in your reality as a free person. It's saying, this is an unfree person. Look at him, look at her. How do you feel now? The protesters outside are moved and motivated. Many of them are carrying the banner, I noticed, from the civil rights movement. I am a man. A compelling kind of assertion of subjective agency against what they see as a refusal of it. Though the artist, to give him his due, he says that actually is what the work is about. And all of them feeling very fragile about the idea that of slavery to be realised again, and examining the concept of slavery, which isn't terribly common in Britain in 2014. I think there's a couple of unhappy individuals were found in a gypsy caravan site a while ago, but really slavery is not so common, but people are interestingly moved to talk about the world in those terms. So I think that's very interesting, a sense of freedom and the value of freedom and its fragility being exercised in a contemporary debate. There's another one that is quite interesting I've noticed, because I know a number of people are just starting university this year, and in the prospectuses and the plans for the new universities, there's a very considered debate about consent in sexual relations, about consent and about rape. Essentially, it's a discussion about rape. There's a plan that a number of universities, Cambridge University in particular, has organised workshops so that people can be explained to what consent is. And like I said, I don't know. I'm not. I don't have to cope with organising a university, but I'm intrigued that that things that maybe would have been assumed or taken for granted as understood or not particularly controversial are today very easily thought. Well, this isn't so straightforward. The question of consent, and consent. Bear in mind that is at the core of the idea of the promise and the self-authorship. When we talk about the refusal of consent or the denial of consent, you're talking about, are you in charge of your destiny? Are you a free agent? Is your freedom acknowledged in this relationship? And we find that when we ask the question, we fear that it might not be, and we're quite open to the idea that it might not be, and we feel that it's very, it must be examined and looked over. And I think that's quite a contemporary attitude. And in all of these, I think the intriguing thing is just how quickly idea of agency, of human relations between free agents are problematized. They're made problematic, that they're seen as fraught with difficulty, that the relations of children to their parents are open to tremendous investigation. So when, as happened in the United States the other day, a woman told her therapist that she'd nipped out and left the kids on their own. Kids are not infants, by the way. They're children, but they're not infants. He picked the phone up and called the police. And, so the therapist is there, and he's immediately kind of imagines this relationship that this woman has with their children as a kind of a dangerous relationship. And this happens several occasions now that police, particularly in the United States, have been arresting women who've left their kids in the park. One woman was told she couldn't send their kids to the park on their own. They weren't to be on their own in the park. And how easily it is to problematize ordinary human relations because, and I think this is at the core of it, is our sense of self, our confident, robust, sense of self is not as robust as it would have been. We're more anxious. We're anxious about other people. You know, we're more likely, I suspect, to see them as difficult or problematic or maybe dangerous or criminal. Or we're willing, more willing perhaps to see that the consent and the promises and all of this might cover some kind of oppressive and aggressive domination, and that it shouldn't be taken so seriously. You know, I speak about myself. You know, it would happen to me a lot. You know, if I'm out with my daughter, people would say, you know, when they were younger, they would say, there was to her, "Are you all right?" And that's a bit of a weird thing. And I mean, it is, you know, guys never used to spend that much time with their kids, you know, so maybe it does look a bit more exceptional, you know, but it was strange. And I think we're often in that position, you know, is this really you know, it's like if you see a couple arguing at night, you know, and you think, well, that's a bit heated, and you're kind of stuck in that. Should I intervene? Should I not? Should I say something? Shouldn't I? I suspect people are less willing to intervene, but more anxious about it. More willing to imagine that an argument is domestic violence on the cusp. Less willing to believe that it's two people having an argument. And I think all of those things really come from the idea of subjectivity as tense, not taken for granted, that our subjective intent might be covering something else. And we see it often in the discussion about consumer values and consumer society, that the choices people make, other people make, strike us as bad. Which is obviously true, by the way. You know, many people make many bad choices. You know, there are whole houses across the whole of Britain full of plastic toys that really should never have been bought, and terrible furniture and awful wallpaper and cigarettes and fatty foods, and, you know, mine especially, obviously. But it's compelling that we're quite judgmental on other people's consumer choices. And when, as people do, you know, you say, well, why are you smoking? The stroppy teenager might say, well, I enjoy it. And at which point you kind of turn off. You think, well, no, you're just a slave of the tobacco companies, and you can't hear them saying it to you. It's obviously not true. Or, you know, I mean, and it isn't true in a way, you know, because most of our eating and drinking and smoking and all these other habits are not entirely rational, because we're not entirely rational, but it's compelling just how quick we are to kind of dismiss other people's freedom and choices and assume that we think we know better about how they should organise their lives. And it's why, for example, schools have started to provide free school meals on a much greater extent, because they don't like what the parents are putting in the sandwiches, which is weird, I think, because what a brilliant system it is to let all of the children in Britain to be raised by adults for free. Wasn't that a fantastic, you know, what government wouldn't be pleased at that? What's wrong with them? You know, how much more expensive it would be to raise them in factories, and how less productive. But nonetheless, you know, the fact that parents do all this gratis, this fabulous work of love and care and concern for their kids doesn't really count for much, because we're willing to believe the worst of them, because, you know, we think, you know, who knows what goes behind closed doors, with a basic distrust of other people's agency and don't take it so seriously. I think I'm kind of, where am I at in time?
You've got 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I want to say, I'm saying that this is the case, and, you know, I could stretch it in other ways, but I'm not going to. I just want to say about why, and I think this is my argument, is that you know, what has undermined the sense of agency. And I think, in short work, I'd say this is a post-contestation, post-ideological age. My parents, your parents, I guess, grew up in a world where essentially, if not very interestedly, they were involved in a kind of an argument about how the world should be. That carried different names, like liberalism or socialism. And it was contested. I mean to say, people argued about it, and they argued about, where should society's resources be. They belonged to clubs and associations based upon that argument, that was what it meant to be in an ideological age, that they ordered their lives. I'm not saying, by the way, these were good, these ideologies. I think they were flawed in lots of ways, but it did mean to say that there was a whole sense in which you could situate yourself in the world by your alliances, by your friendships, by your class. It would often be on a basis of class. My mother was a Mori Pole person years and years ago, and she said, I said, well, is it hard? She said, no, I stand at the top of the street. It was in Leeds. And she'd say, I look down the street, and I'd say, oh yeah, those are Labour voters. And I put them all down as Labour voters. And then she'd go to another place, it was a bit more semi-detached. Say, oh, well, those are Tory voters, And if she wasn't sure, maybe half of them are Lib Dems. Liberals, as would have been. And that was a reasonable assumption, I would have said, at that time, when people would say, you grew up in it. My dad voted Labour, I vote Labour. And it was, or the other way around. It was a clannish and a social, it was quite a social kind of a world where people would be involved in churches, in all kinds of cultural activities organised around that, or different kinds of ways that they'd be related to the world. Our contemporary world is kind of the end of that. That argument kind of happened sometime around the end of the 20th century. Both sides of the debate collapsed, exhausted. I mean, I think one side did win better than the others, but not very convincingly, and they celebrated a bit like a tug-of-war team by all falling over. To say the neoliberal dispensation isn't very, very strongly made. Mrs. Thatcher used to say this, if only we could sweep away this kind of crustation of socialism on top of everything, we'd uncover these healthy individuals would kind of sprout like green shoots. And they were always looking for those green shoots of recovery, but it never really worked. They did indeed demolish the core institutions of Labour Party socialism. But underneath, there wasn't this kind of robust individual bursting out to go free. I think that was kind of given in a way, is that on the contrary, people felt very insecure because they didn't have the relationships to each other, to the world, to projects, no sense of future orientation around a struggle, and I mean that on both sides of the political divide. And we don't see robust and healthy individuals. I think on that score, Mrs. Thatcher definitely had it wrong, as on so many, you might say. But the idea that, if you just get rid of that welfare state, that we'd all become entrepreneurs, turned out to be not quite right, and I think on the contrary, but first off, we didn't get rid of the welfare state. It just became much more kind of individualistic, funnily enough. And second, people do not become more confident with the less structures and certainty they have around them. On the contrary, it makes them much more anxious. So I'd say the sense of agency, I think it's still a robust system. It works very well that when you go to the newsagent, you give the guy the money, he gives you the newspaper. It's pretty straightforward. He doesn't, it's not like surrealism. He's not going to hand you a fish or anything like that. It works, it's dull, but thank God, it's dull in that respect. So we can be imaginative in other respects. But so it is robust, but I think there's definitely a weakening. I think of it like a weakening of the sense of agency, and that's where I think ought to stop and give it over to you lot.
Right, okay, thank you very much, James.